Welcome everyone, and thank you for taking part in today's webinar, Decarbonizing the Mediterranean Energy System through Electrification. This is an event jointly organized by the Global Sustainable Electricity Partnership, the Observatoire méditéranéen de l'énergie, and Morocco's Office National de l'Électricité et de l'Eau Potable. I'm Isabelle Migré from GSEP, and I'll be hosting today's session. We'll hear two presentations today from our presenters, Lisa Guerrara and Adriana Paz. But before we start, I will invite our partners to say a few words. First, let me introduce Ms. Ouda Alal, General Director of the Observatoire méditéranéen de l'énergie. Ms. Alal.
Thank you very much. Good morning and good afternoon to all. I'm very pleased to open this webinar, which I'm sure is the first step of closer cooperation between GSEP and ONÉE. Let me first thank ONÉE and in particular Mr. Abdelrahim Al-Hafidi, CEO of ONÉE, Chairman of GSEP and member of ONÉE board, and also Khalil Lakhtari from ONÉE, Chairman of ONÉE Strategy and International Cooperation, for making this event happen. We are indeed gathering today and joining forces thanks to their initiative. Thank you very much. Thank you also to our colleagues from GSEP. It was a great pleasure cooperating with you in organizing this event. We look forward to a fruitful event and more to come. Last but not least, thank you to all for joining today. Before giving the floor to Mr. Lakhtari, let me very briefly introduce the Observatoire méditéranéen de l'énergie. ONÉE is a non-for-profit energy industry association gathering leading energy organizations around the Mediterranean. We are unique of our kind organization as it looks at all energy pathways. ONÉE brings 30 years of experience in regional energy dialogue, high-level events, and pioneering studies. We are the reference in the Euromed cooperation through our involvement in the Union for the Mediterranean Energy Platforms, several multilateral fora, and European Commission projects. We are the voice of the energy industry. So if you have interest in the energy in the Mediterranean region and are not yet a member, you are welcome to join us as well. We will discuss today a topic which is of very timely, of high interest to the region, also in the eve of COP26. Decarbonizing the Mediterranean is indeed a must, and the electrification of the Mediterranean economy is on its way. So let's see today how would this happen and what would be the impact. Thank you again for all for joining. Thank you to our speakers, Lisa and Adriana. I wish you a fruitful discussion. Thank you again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Alal. And now let's welcome Mr. Khalil Lakhtari, Cooperation and Partnership Director from the Office National de l'Électricité et de l'Eau Potable.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you, Isabelle. Let me first welcome you to this webinar organized by two prestigious organizations in cooperation with the ONÉE, GSEP, which is an alliance of world's leading electricity company, currently shared by ONÉE, and ONÉE, Association of Actors of the Energy Sector in the Mediterranean region, with its northern and southern sides, and to which ONÉE is a member, as Dr. Ouda just mentioned. As you know, the energy mix is expected to become far more diversified globally, with an increase in the role of renewable energy, in particular in the electricity sector, but not only, as well as electrification of our economies. In such a context, achieving carbon neutrality would not only involve a significant further acceleration in the deployment of clean energy and technologies over the future, but would also require wide-ranging behavioral changes. The Observatoire méditéranéen de l'énergie, ONÉE, will highlight the near zero carbon scenario and its tendency on the energy mix in the Mediterranean region, and focus on decarbonization and its impacts and the role of electrification. GSEP members believe that the progress in achieving climate and sustainable development goals can only be made if all actors mobilize to accelerate electrification of our societies. For electricity to be a vital pathway to the decarbonization, it must be cleaner, affordable, flexible, and efficient. Moreover, extensive electrification of end-use sectors such as transport, buildings, and industry will be needed. All of these changes must happen at a rapid pace. I'm very happy to have ONÉE and GSEP together today to jointly discuss this topic of decarbonization of the Mediterranean energy system toward electrification, but also toward GSEP members. Thank you, ONÉE and GSEP, for having us all together around such an important topic. Thank you to all for joining us. I wish you a fruitful discussion and best discussion. And thank you to Lisa and Adriana for their speech. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lactari. Now let's welcome Mr. Vincent Michel Duval, Executive Director of the Global Sustainable Electricity Partnership.
Good morning, everyone, or afternoon, depending where you are. Pleasure to be here. Thank you, Isabelle, for your kind words. I'd like to thank Madame Huda Halal and also Mr. Khalil Lactari for joining us today for this joint event with ONÉE and ONÉE. Thank you for this collaboration, which is a pioneering partnership. I'm looking forward to do more of those joint events. So obviously today we'll be talking about the energy transition, decarbonization of our economies. It's a key trend, obviously, leading to COP26 and more discussions. So, and when we're talking about this energy transition, we're often, and it's very important to talk about the decarbonization of the power sector and the electrification of the end uses, because there are two essential measures that are the art of any energy transition strategy. So after all, the power sector in itself, and you'll see that further on in this presentation, is responsible for the largest share of energy-related GHG. So reducing the carbon content of the power sector is crucial, but it's also needed to, at the same time, rapidly ramp up firm, reliable, low-carbon generation. And you'll see that covered today. This would thus allow us to electrify the transport sector, the building sector, industry sector, as Mr. Lactari just talked about. In a nutshell, you'll see it's a huge challenge in front of us, obviously, but it's through collaboration with all end users and stakeholders, but also through innovation and through clear policies that our government that we will be able to achieve our common objective, a clean, sustainable energy sector. So thank you so much for your attention, and have a great day.
Thank you, Mr. Duval, and thanks to all our partners for making this event possible. Without further ado, we'll move on to the first presentation from Lisa Guerrara. Please note that there will be a Q&A session after the two presentations. We invite you to type in your questions in the Q&A section, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. Lisa Guerrara joined the Observatoire méditéranéen de l'énergie in 2005 and is currently the director of the Monitoring and Modeling Division. As such, she oversees OME's work on its historical data, outlooks, and forecasts, and is in charge of overall consistency of modeling work and resulting messages. Ms. Guerrara is also in charge of producing the Mediterranean Energy Perspectives, OME's flagship publication. The division produces medium to long-term energy demand, efficiency, power generation, renewables, and environmental analysis for the Mediterranean Energy Perspectives and other publications. She also conducts analysis on various energy topics such as energy efficiency, energy security, carbon emissions, energy transition, electrification, and hydrogen. Ms. Guerrara, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, everyone, for joining. Well, thanks for the introduction. And I'd like to jump in straight into the heart of the matter. Oops, seems I cannot share my screen. Okay, I wanted to launch the presentation. Yep. Okay, it's happening. There we go. Okay, can you see it?
Yes,
Yeah.
we can see.
Thank you. Okay. Well, I'll jump over what Uda just presented about ONÉE, and I'll get straight to the matter at hand. So what I'll be presenting today is taken mainly from the Mediterranean energy perspectives, and this is a publication we present and we publish every 2 years that presents the past situation, the present situation, and the long-term prospects for the whole energy demand and the whole Mediterranean. As such, obviously, we took into consideration the COVID impact, but we also looked at the long term to 2050, and we always have two scenarios. One is the reference scenario that takes into account current trends and to some extent the lesser targets of the NDCs, the national determined countries objectives. And we also have a proactive scenario that incorporates in full the NDCs. Now for this edition, we worked closely with the European Commission and the UFM platforms to design a decarbonization scenario, so what we call a near zero carbon scenario. What you need to know is the map is an actual based on in-house econometrics model that we developed and that we run for several scenarios, including the near zero carbon scenario. The actual, what we call the ProMed scenario, which is the decarbonization scenario, is actually not full decarbonization about 2050. It's full decarbonization for EU countries, and it's actually aiming for full decarbonization of South Mediterranean by 2060. Now, of course, we followed for the EU countries the Green Deal that's been published, but it hasn't given yet country specific. So we incorporated all the countries that had specific plans already devised, but of course some didn't. So we had to make some assumptions. Looking at the non-EU countries, obviously we based ours on what they are publishing, what they are saying they're willing to do, and of course making some extrapolation of what that would mean to reach the same level as the EU. Now, what is the Mediterranean? First of all, the coverage, obviously, which we cover 26 countries, of which 21 are modeled separately. So we actually have individual country models. To situate a bit the Mediterranean, it's actually currently 550 million people, 1,000 million TOE per year, around 2,000 million tons of CO2, and around 10 trillion euros of GDP. Now, what's interesting is that basically the Mediterranean is 7% of the world, 7% of the world population, 7% of the world energy demand, and 7% of the GDP. Now, what's interesting is it's only 6% of CO2 emissions, which means it's actually doing fairly well. A lot of it can be attributed to the efforts that have already been engaged by an EU country mainly. Now, looking at the drivers of energy demand, it has always been, still is, and is going to continue being the population increase and the GDP increase for obvious reasons. It has always been in the past. There's a very strong correlation. We are trying, of course, the Mediterranean is trying to decorrelate from excessive increase of energy and link to its population and GDP, but the facts are that up to 2050, we're going to be adding over 120 million people, nearly 130 million in the Mediterranean as a whole, and actually most of it, and actually more of it, is in the South countries, as the North Mediterranean countries are actually seeing their population decrease. In terms of GDP, both GDPs are expected to increase to 2050, but of course, in South Mediterranean, this is expected to be much stronger. As a result, in 2050, most of the population and the GDP will be happening in the South Mediterranean. That's important because it drives trends, and it's also showing the impact of possible renewables potentials and other sources. Now, looking at the energy demand, so overall, this is the result of our scenarios. All energies contribute together. What we're looking at is the past. So what we see in the past is that over the last 30 years, energy demand in the Mediterranean increased by 44%. If current trends continue, and that means still incorporating some of the effects of the NDCs and some energy efficiency, we'd still see 37% increase to 2050, which of course is greatly unsustainable. Now, if we're looking to decarbonize by 2050, this means the energy demand actually has to decrease by 17% compared to today's levels. I think this is one of the key messages, is the energy efficiency. It's not just switching fuels, it's also reducing, decorrelating our energy demand from the increasing population and GDP. And that means, of course, less consumption per capita than we had. Of course, compared to what the current trends would take us to by 2050, this means we'd actually have to diminish by 43%. Looking at what it means by region, I've already exposed that there's two different trends in the region in terms of population, and it's also the case in terms of energy demand. Actually, in the North Mediterranean, the demand has already been decreasing steadily since 2005. Of course, even in a reference scenario, this would continue, but only up to 12% decrease by 2050. Whereas in a decarbonization scenario, we'd have a minus 42%, which means that from today's levels of consumption, you'd have to reduce this by 42%, bearing in mind that the population only slightly decreases. In the South Mediterranean, obviously, an increase is expected. But as you can see on the graph, if we continue as we are, this is more than doubling the energy demand in the South. If we go for decarbonization, the increase in energy demand would just be limited to 21%. Now, what does it mean in terms of end usages and power generation? So those are the two main sectors that use up energy. There's power generation and the end use sectors. Looking at what happens in end use sectors, and that's transport, buildings, industry, not only do we need to decrease the actual energy content, we actually need to shift and to decarbonize. So quite rightly, what we're expecting, so this graph is showing the change. That means the addition or the reduction that needs to be made in fuels by 2000, from now to 2050. So without any, how would you say, a surprise, the fossil fuels are expected to decrease substantially compared to today's levels. Now, of course, what will replace it in the end usage is electricity and renewables. So this means displacing most of the usages towards electricity and renewables. In the power generation sector, this means how do we produce electricity? And what we're going to see at the Mediterranean levels is a decrease again in fossil fuels. A lot of gas and coal will disappear in favor of renewables. So all additions will be renewables. There's a slight decrease in nuclear, but this is a very divergent, I mean, there's very different paths in that, because there's increasing in the south, in the north, it's really depending on each country. So altogether, there's a slight reduction, but this doesn't impact as much as the decrease in fossil fuel, and definitely switching away from fossils and increasing only renewables. In the transport sector, and I think this is one of the sectors that's going to be the most affected by decarbonization, and where it's going to be the hardest, because as you see in red, the electricity share, that means the amount of electricity in the mix, is just 1% presently. To be able to achieve decarbonization in the transport sector, there's a slight decrease, but actually what we see is the demand will remain rather flat. And that's actually conflicting trends between the north, where it's actually reducing, and the south, where it's increasing. Now, regardless, what we need by 2050 in a decarbonized future is a third of the mix basically being electricity, a third still being oil, and the remainder being split between renewables and gas. Obviously, already you see that the feat is quite tremendous and sizable, and this means changing the habits. And it's not just about moving to an electricity vehicle. To be able to achieve this level of decarbonization and reducing, or at least keeping, the transportation trends to not increasing, this means switching actual modes of transport, rethinking cities and the way we commute and the way we transport goods, so on and so forth. So there's a huge behavioral change that's expected behind these numbers. And of course, by 2050, in the EU countries, the share of electricity would be more closer to 50%. So yeah, it's really an achievement that needs to be done, and definitely that needs to be embarked upon now. Looking at the building sector, sector is already currently around 39% of the mix being electricity. Now, when we look at the change expected over the next 30 years, basically fossil fuels are declining strongly. It's a decrease of 60% of fossil fuels, an increase in electricity of 20%, and a doubling of renewable usage in the building sector. By 2050, electricity should represent 50% of the energy mix. So that means half of what's consumed in buildings, residential and commerces and administration would be 50% electricity. Again, the actual total buildings demand will actually be decreasing. So what we are doing is we need to replace all the fossil fuel usages by electricity, all the while boosting energy efficiency. In the industry sector, it's a real challenge, especially in the South, where there's a lot of heavy industries. So staying away from coal, oil and gas is going to be a big challenge, but processes are being put in place. And we're expecting, so of course, the electrification of industry to be much more prominent in the North than it is in the South. Regardless, overall, basically in the industry sector, oil will decrease over the next 30 years, so will coal, to actually nearly disappear, whereas it will be replaced by electricity, renewables, and to some extent gas, because actually gas is a cleaner fuel and it will ensure a safe transition in industry while being able to still carry out heavy industry. Looking at the electricity demand, what that means in terms of total electricity. Well, what that means is that we're going to see an increase of electricity demand by 74% over the next 30 years. What will change, as I said, is the breakdown of the mix. And as of today, the actual mix for electricity demand in end usages is 22%, so not even a quarter. By 2050, we're expecting electricity to account for 40%, 41% of the usages, all the while having the generation moving from a quarter of its electricity being generated from renewables to 79%. So we're moving to electricity in the end use sector, and we're decarbonizing electricity production. Now, in terms of generation, what I was showing you before was the demand. The generation, we're assuming and we're expecting reductions in losses and distribution losses and transmission losses. We're expecting improvement in generation, and of course, the increase of renewables in the mix. What's interesting to see is that between 1990 and 2018, the renewable share increased, but in 30 years, it didn't even increase by a 10-point percentage. We went from 17% to 26%. Whereas over the next 30 years, by 2050, it should reach nearly 80%. The increase in generation would just be 66%, so a bit lower than the 74% in electricity demand. As you can see, one of the new players or buffers to help alleviate and optimize electricity generation is going to be electricity storage. And so by 2050, this will account for a share of electricity being used in the system. Looking at what it means in terms of capacity additions, and especially in terms of technologies, what we see again is a fossil fuel addition, the capacities will be removed A lot will be retired, some will be retired early. Same with overall nuclear, but actually it's in the north that they're retiring and increasing in the south. Hydro additions remain limited. The main additions will be from wind and solar, and much more solar. As you can see, the north and south are somewhat balanced in terms of additions, which might sound fair, but isn't when you consider that the south will by 2050 be a much bigger market. And on top of this, they have the potentialities for wind and solar. So even in a decarbonized scenario, by 2050, the potential in the south is underused. Now, again, there's also battery storage capacity that will need to be added on both shores. Looking at what it means in terms of CO2 implications, if you look at what happened between 1990 and 2018, CO2 emissions increased by 30%. And whereas to reach the decarbonization levels that we've presented in terms of energy, that means we're reducing by 75% CO2 emissions. It means that by 2050, the region will actually produce 3 times less emissions than it did in 1990. This is a huge feat to achieve. In the north, especially, the zero would then be achieved by being at just under 76. And for the south, that means it would be more or less at the levels that were slightly above the 1990 levels. But I think one of the real impacts that actually will bring a lot of positivity to the region is the impact on energy dependence. Energy security in the region is very important and has been having really adverse effects. The Mediterranean is very, very linked to this problem of energy dependence, but on one side, the countries are very dependent, and on the other side, the producers, who actually are also very dependent on their revenues. Now, what happens today is that we have a very dependent region, so it's nearly 40% as a whole. So that means that 40% of its fossil fuel needs are imported. In the north, it's actually nearly close to 60%. And in the south, despite having oil and gas producers, that's only a 9%. It's still a 9% importing ratio. Of course, going for decarbonization, this means that by 2050, the actual whole region, obviously, would be net exporter. And this means that for countries that depend on energy, that means they will reduce their import bill. For producers, that means they will increase their revenues. So it's a win-win whether you're an importer or an exporter, and it would help alleviate a lot of tensions. So it's not just CO2 emissions, it's not just climate, it's also the energy security in the region that's at stake, and that would improve vastly from moving to decarbonization. In terms of energy investments, we've calculated and estimated more or less that would come to 6 trillion euros cumulative investments in the energy sector to 2050, including the energy efficiency measures. This means around 200 billion euros per year on average, which is more or less 1.2 to 1.4% of the GDP of each country per year. This means that it's a lot, it's true, but actually the studies that have now come out about the cost of inaction, which means not going for decarbonization and having to cover the costs of climate change, would actually go up to 2–3% of GDP. So actually, what the studies are now showing, whether from the EU or the OECD, is that 6 trillion is actually much less than the cost that you'd have to cover if you went for having to cater for all the climate change adverse effects. Now, on top of this, you have to add to this that is 6 trillion. Even if you go for non-decarbonization, it would indeed cost less. We estimate that would be 4 trillion for staying on current trends, but it's still 4 trillion. So it's actually just a differential that would have to be added. The actual problem there is in investments is that in a decarbonization scenario, it's no longer the same places and investors and sectors. So basically, if I take transport, it's not just the energy and producing fossil fuels or fuel cells and so on that needs to be addressed. It's actually changing the whole system, transport system, behavior. So all this, it costs money, and it's not necessarily the same place you put the money, and it's probably not as easy to catch investors on that. Having said this, we find in the investment breakdown by usage, for the hydrocarbons, there's still some additional investment that's for producing, it's actually upstream. For actually the main place where the investments will be needed is energy efficiency that I've just mentioned, it's half the investments, and electricity. The electricity sector alone will account for 40% of the total investments by 2050. Now, to wrap up a bit, current trends are definitely not sustainable. And it's not just because of climate change, it's also posing energy security concerns in the region. And the three pillars to achieve decarbonization is definitely electrification, energy efficiency, and renewables. These three items have to be addressed, and it's actually covering the whole sectors. It's not just energy, and it's all technologies and policies that need to be put together in place as soon as possible. I mean, one of the important messages is that the cost of inaction outweighs that of decarbonization. And furthermore, what hasn't been put into these numbers is the potential, the higher potential for job creation in a decarbonized future. Especially domestic job creation. So this is something that hasn't been factored in, and that would add, of course, to the virtuous circle of moving to decarbonization. I think that one of the key as well is going to be the regional and the dialogue and cooperation is how much of a win-win we can do, and definitely coming here together, discussing it and getting different industry actors and organizations and policy makers, getting everyone on board to be able to exchange, to share, and to move forward together. So I thank you all very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Guerrera, for this insightful presentation. Let's now move on to Adriana Paz's presentation. Adriana is the Senior Advisor Electrification at GSEP. She oversees GSEP's research on electrification of end uses. With over 11 years working in sustainable energy, her work currently focuses on following and explaining the spread and pace of end-use electrification across sectors, showing where the bottlenecks lie and identifying the unlocks to accelerate the energy transition. Adriana also has extensive experience in building and maintaining multi-stakeholder partnerships in the energy sector. Adriana, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Isabel. And so let me share my screen. So good day to everybody and welcome. And we just heard a very interesting presentation from Lisa that has given you really an overview of the major forces at play when looking to decarbonize the Mediterranean region in specific. And what I want to do is actually zoom out a little bit from the region for a moment and look at the global context of decarbonizing through electrification and present to you some of the opportunities and challenges that arise from an electricity end user perspective. So just very quickly, I want to reintroduce you the Global Sustainable Electricity Partnership. So as Mr. Lagarde said, we are a CEO-led alliance of leading global electricity companies. Our mission is really to promote cleaner electricity generation, energy efficiency, and electrification as pathways to reach global development and climate goals. And as has been already mentioned, this year our chair company is Morocco's Office National de l'Électricité et de l'Eau Potable, and which happens to be our first African chair. And our members are among the largest utilities in the world, and actually around 1/3 of all electricity consumed worldwide is produced and transmitted by our members. So with that in mind, let's just jump into the heart of the presentation. And the reality is that the challenges being faced by the Mediterranean region that was presented to you by Lisa is actually a global reality. And so the energy sector really underpins all aspects of modern societies, but it is also responsible as a whole for 3/4 of the global greenhouse gas emissions. And of these, over 1/3 come directly from the power sector alone. So really, we know that the only solution moving forward to really meet climate change mitigation targets is to move away from fossil fuels. And this energy transition is really essential and cannot happen without the decarbonization of energy mixes and the electrification of end uses across the globe. And when you look really, like Lisa said, the cost of inaction, if there are no major additional efforts made on this front, emissions are going to really stay around the same levels, as you can see in this graph depicted by the blue line. But when the energy sector is put at the heart of the solution, then the effect can be great. And as you can see depicted by the green line, which shows you how emissions fall substantially when the global economy is really powered mostly by renewables. And as the electricity sector becomes cleaner, then electrification of end uses emerges as a crucial tool to continue the reduction of these emissions across all economies. Now, even if our local realities are different, the challenge again faced by the Mediterranean countries is really similar across the board. So in this chart, you can see that regardless of the region in the world, energy mixes are predominantly fossil fuel based today. The Mediterranean region is right there on the top. Obviously, some of the countries in there overlap with some of the other regions depicted below, but you can see that mostly everybody is being currently fueled, at least more than half, by fossil fuels. So we all must first take steps to first decarbonize electricity supply and ensure that the access to this clean electricity is reliable and affordable, and then follow with the electrification of end uses to really make the big impact. And that was really shown by the presentation made by ONÉE. Now, the big caveat is, of course, that there's no one size fits all solution. And the approach to a clean energy transition is going to be different depending on region and also depending by country. So each region and country in particular is at a different stage of economic development. More advanced economies will probably reach net zero emissions before developing economies do. And as this is the case pointed out in the Mediterranean region between the North and the Southern Mediterranean countries. Now, when you look at electrification rates among the 3 major sectors, you can see that there's really great scope for electrification globally and in all major regions. So in this graph, you can see the share of electricity in the energy consumption in each of the 3 major sectors. And the Mediterranean region is depicted there in green. So you can see that compared to all other regions, everybody is more or less at the same level. Currently, the global share of electricity in the energy consumption mix is just 1% in transport, 32% for buildings, and 28% for industry. And that rate and level is pretty much the same across the board, across all regions. We at GSEP believe that electrification rates must at least double in order to meet net zero goals by 2050. And this means obviously then the shares of electricity for end use in consumption mixes need to really substantially grow. And there's plenty of room still for it to do so, as depicted here in the graph. Now, if we take a little step back and we kind of ask ourselves the questions, why are we all really focusing on electricity? Why do we believe in GSEP that electricity is the energy of choice to accelerate the energy transition? And this is really because electricity has 4 key qualities. So first, electricity is efficient and creates a much more efficient output. And thanks to this, the electrification of end uses results in a significant reduction in overall energy consumption, which means then the costs of use are lower. And also it limits the impact of new types of consumption on existing infrastructure. Secondly, electricity is flexible. So as you electrify end uses, then your portfolio of energy sources becomes more diversified, and your energy system then becomes much more resilient and secure because of this diversification. Flexibility, electricity also provides flexibility in demand management. Electrification allows for the optimization of renewable generation by coupling power, heat, and mobility. And then thirdly, electricity really fuels economic and social development. It's a key enabler, and access to clean electricity for all is really a springboard for many of the sustainable development goals outlined by the United Nations. So it is really at the heart of moving societies forward. And then finally, electricity is the energy of the digital, modern, and urbanized world. These trends are on the rise, and they cannot be sustained without an increase in the use of electricity. So before we go any further, I just wanted to explain a bit like what the GSEP refers to when we actually talk about electrification. And for us, really, it goes beyond the production of and delivery of clean, affordable, resilient, and reliable electricity. For us, we talk about beneficial electrification, which means furthering economic growth, community and social advancement. It means improving environmental conditions. It means developing and deploying advanced innovative technologies to help customers. It means creating new partnerships. And it also means informing and supporting public policies. So really, it's a holistic approach that we're taking towards electrification. And it's just not about producing and selling more electricity, but making sure that the electricity, as it increases in the share of energy consumption, it actually contributes to the advancement of society as a whole. So in the last 5 years, GSEP has led extensive work on the topic of electrification. There have been several reports that we have published that really provide an industry perspective on the future of electricity and its role in the energy transition. And today I want to focus on our latest study that we published this year that really brings forward for the first time the voice of over 110 electricity end users from the transport, industry, and building sectors spread over 10 countries, and where they're really providing direct insights on what they need to accelerate the energy transition. And you may be asking yourselves, why end users and why are we focusing on them? And the truth of the matter is that they are the key decision makers in adopting electricity-based solutions. So governments can really set the tone, setting their targets for decarbonization. We can have roadmaps and studies that we have led, that the ONÉE has led to providing the roadmap to how we can electrify. But at the end of the day, it's end users that need to adopt the electrification. And without them on board, we cannot really meet any of the decarbonization goals. So we really have to understand their specific considerations and requirements to make sure that we can unlock further acceleration. So without further ado, let me present to you what the main findings of our report. So the first question we asked was, what did end users expect to gain the most when electrifying? And as you can see here, while decarbonization is really the most salient upside, electrification is really perceived to offer a wide range of positive benefits. So they range from environmental, financial, and labor upsides. Obviously, the benefits associated with electrification depend on the local context. This is most obvious for decarbonization as a benefit. There are large differences between countries depending on the extent to which electricity is carbon-free. And so it's not surprising that the perception of decarbonization as a benefit also differs between countries. So for example, in the Mediterranean country of France that has a lower carbon power grid, and users really perceive decarbonization as a key benefit of electrification, whereas in other countries that rely a bit more on fossil fuels, it's ranked lower. Another thing I wanted to point out in terms of benefits is that for some end users, electrification brings about lower costs. And this is whether it's lower energy costs or costs of ownership. So a lower upfront investment, lower maintenance costs, lower insurance costs. They also pointed out that it provided some cost efficiencies. And they also said that it would bring savings through improved efficiency, which, as you remember, is one of the key qualities of electricity. So actually half of all survey respondents experienced some type of cost saving, and highlights that as one of the key drivers for their electrification journey. When you flip the coin and then think, okay, so electrification is being seen as mostly beneficial, so why are we not really seeing a substantial increase in its uptake? And the end users in the study really described a range of challenges and barriers that prevent them from really further increasing electrification. So the end users mentioned economic barriers as a main hurdle. So over 2/3 of the companies interviewed mentioned an unfavorable economic case as one of the main obstacles preventing them from scaling up electrification. Other obstacles cited by end users are related to technological limitations, lack of infrastructure, and lack of awareness, both from their own customers and also from perhaps government entities or their local governments. End users also sometimes mention a variety of technological limits, and these actually tend to be very specific to the subsector or a concrete end use. So for example, those that selected technological limits as one of the barriers tend to come from either cement production or steam production subsectors or long distance freight transport, where currently there's not a viable path to directly electrify. So that's why they're seeing it now today as a main barrier. And when you actually zoom in into the main hurdle cited, which is unfavorable economic case, and you look at it by sector, we see that really the unfavorable economics is more salient obstacle in the buildings and industry sectors than in the transport sector. And this is really because in the transport sector, the end users tend to be a bit more optimistic about the decreasing cost of batteries, for example, and also about the prospects of electric vehicles' total cost of operation becoming on par with internal combustion engines. So because of those two outlooks, they really feel more optimistic, and then they feel that in the future, it will make more economic sense to really switch to electricity. But the truth is that based on today's technologies and price regimes, electrification often doesn't come with a positive business case. So this explains why it's really the most cited barrier. And it also explains why the transition is happening only gradually, and why the current uptake really falls short of what we would really be required to fulfill all the decarbonization ambitions set forth by governments and others. So then we asked what measures really, what factors would have the most effect on your decision to electrify? What would be the main drivers for electrification? And drivers that could really help us tackle the main barriers and really accelerate the transition. And end users mentioned a broad range of drivers, from improvements in the economics of electric solutions to well-targeted policies and regulations that can play a role, easier permitting processes, expansions in infrastructure, as in the case for charging infrastructure for the transport sector. These perceptions were really no surprise for us. The drivers mentioned are really in line with the key enablers that GSEP had already identified in one of our previous studies, particularly last year's studies on building electrification alliance and partnerships across the value chain. So it was really no surprise, but it's important to hear it directly from the end users themselves. So what is clear is that it's really to incentivize companies to electrify. It's vital to make the economics work for them, and that is really a no-brainer. And according to end users, building an attractive economic case for electrification involves, among other things, addressing really the challenges that relate to peak demand and the associated charges that come that really deters end users from further fuel switching to electricity, because it really increases their cost. It makes no economic sense in that way. Obviously, well-targeted policies and regulations have a really important role to play in accelerating the transition as well, because they can help level the playing field between electricity and other fuels. Overall, when we synthesized all the findings across the interviews, 8 initiatives really emerged that end users identified as helpful for accelerating electrification. And these can be really structured into 3 categories. So in green, you have the category of increasing the supply of decarbonized and reliable electricity. You have raising awareness among policymakers and end users and use consumers in blue. And then in yellow, you have enhancing the value proposition for customers. So for the sake of time, I'm not going to go over all of them. Some of them, as you can read, they're really self-explanatory, but I just wanted to highlight a few. So in the green category, this is something that really comes up often in discussions around electrification, and that's ensuring the reliability of grids to reassure end users that electrification is actually a low-risk investment. And the reliable energy supply obviously is vital for customers and for companies. And I just wanted to mention that this is something that we as utilities really focus on a lot and are really committed to ensure that it is the case. So it did pop up on our conversations with end users, and we wanted to just reassure that that's something that we obviously have in mind. In the blue category, I wanted to talk about a little bit more about encourage supportive policies and regulations to stimulate the uptake of electrified solutions. So this obviously goes back to building a favorable economic case for electrification. Obviously, introducing well-targeted supportive measures and incentives can and help enable and accelerate the fuel switch to electricity. For instance, in some countries where tax policies often implicitly favor other energies such as gas, for example, over electricity, governments can really play a role in revising these policies and aligning them with the broader decarbonization policies that they have already put in place or are planning to put in place. Actually, end users in this category had provided a couple of examples. So they mentioned that having a hard mandate or caps and reporting requirements, and also having carbon taxes could really incentivize a change in patterns. So they were really vocal on precise measures that can really help, that governments can really do to help switch the switch towards electricity. And then I also wanted to highlight in the yellow, the collaboration with end users by sharing the know-how and expertise. So obviously, stakeholders that are critical to the electrification transition often lack the relevant knowledge and experience to actually make the transition themselves. And this is also one of the reasons why we thought it was really important to actually go to the end users and ask them about their electrification journey to date. So engaging with end users and training them is really vital for all initiatives to be successful. And this is something, again, that we as utilities are really committed to taking on. So end users in the study actually identified utilities as their main partner of choice to help increase the degree of electrification across sectors. They know that we have a know-how that we are uniquely positioned to offer this know-how and expertise to them. They also provided some examples of collaboration programs that have really proven successful, such as partnerships, that have often come outside the regular business of an energy provider, but that has helped the end users work towards the common objective. So for example, for the deployment of EV infrastructure, it's not uncommon to see utilities partner up with end users or with other players across the value chain to actually help the infrastructure come into place, even though that's not necessarily something that in a regular business of selling electricity you would do. I would like to give you, though, some examples of what some of our Mediterranean member utilities are actually doing on the ground to help end users with their electrification journey, and also an example of what an end user themselves are implementing on the ground. So in France, to accelerate the penetration of heat pumps in all sectors, and also then encourage the efficient decarbonization of buildings in the industry, our member utility, EDF, has been forging many partnerships to develop new products, improve the quality of installation. They're also working to promote heat pumps used to referral network. That comes back to what I mentioned last time regarding the sharing our know-how with the end users to ensure that they know the benefits associated and that they can really understand why it could be good for them to switch to electricity. EDF is also very active in the industrial sector. They're working to develop prototypes and demonstrators for testing under real conditions, and really innovating and driving innovation for different segments. In Italy, for example, ONÉE is experimenting with different models to deploy electrification at a large scale. And when we're talking large scale, we're talking about in this case in Sardinia, which is a whole island in Italy. They're actually helping Sardinia completely decarbonize the island so that they can overcome the current barriers of electrification, which in the case of Sardinia boils down to lack of technologies available and incentives. They're focusing their efforts there on the buildings and transport sector as the main levers to really help Sardinia move towards decarbonization. And they're hoping that they can show that this island will be able to actually skip going to gas before going to net zero carbon. And so they'll skip the gas and really use the island's natural resources, specifically sun and wind and water, really to electrify and start providing a decarbonized energy supply. And according to their calculations, as something Lisa also mentioned, the electrification of at a large scale in Sardinia, for example, will actually create around 10,000 to 50,000 new jobs. So the effect will be a positive one overall. And then finally, just showing you on the other side what actually end users themselves are doing. And this is an example from Morocco. So a Moroccan phosphate and fertilizer producer that is in a sector that has a very high energy demand, was able to actually lower their energy demand, and increase its share of clean electricity by putting in place a couple of things. One, they developed a cogeneration capacity to recover the thermal energy released during production and convert it into electricity. They installed also wind and solar power, and they completed several energy efficiency measures. And at the end, now 88% of the company's energy needs come now from clean or renewable energy, and it's actually producing 25% of Morocco's carbon-free electricity. So this is just an example of how also, depending on the situation of an end user, they can actually take sometimes matters into their own hands and move their journey towards electrification a bit faster. So in conclusion, I just wanted to say that An energy transition is obviously essential, and it cannot happen again without the decarbonization of the energy sector and the electrification of end uses across the world. Electrification is really expected to play an important role. All energy outlooks consistently show that electrification rates and emission reductions really go hand in hand, alongside other important decarbonization levers, such as, obviously, as we talked already, decarbonizing the power supply, ramping up other low carbon energy sources, and enhancing energy efficiency. The challenge to decarbonize that's faced by the Mediterranean region is similar across the world. And despite the recent momentum, we've seen overall electrification rates remain low everywhere. Electrification has a range of advantages for companies across sectors, as well for a wide society. And that was something that really is clear, especially from this study that we did directly with the end users. The advantages mentioned range from decarbonization to cost savings and process efficiencies, better working conditions, reduced environmental impact, such as reduced noise and reduced local pollution. And so in light of these benefits, many of the survey participants anticipate a further uptake of electricity, be it because there's market forces that are incentivizing to, or regulatory forces that are making them make this change. Some of the companies are actually driven also by customer expectations around decarbonization. They're feeling the pull by their consumers as well. But at the end of the day is, despite having the level of ambition to electrify increasing, many of the end users still across all sectors perceive the transition as a challenging task. They face significant hurdles, and the speed of change is really slower than required. And so a range of barriers, mostly related to a lack of adequate incentives, are hindering further uptake and faster uptake. And so really going forward, we have to address these barriers to help accelerate the rate of electrification and capture more of the associated benefits. This is a first step. Understanding and addressing the specific considerations and requirements from end users is really important. And also, end users really rely on a variety of stakeholders to enable the transition. They have identified electric utilities as their main partner of choice. And I just want to leave you saying, obviously, electric utilities, we're ready to take on the challenge, we're ready to take on that role, but we cannot be successful without new partnerships that facilitate the solution for the end users' challenges. And that's also a point made by Lisa before. Building partnerships around electrification is really the way forward to accelerate the energy transition for all. It's really by collaborating with different stakeholders, especially our customers, government entities, and other big industry players, such as, for example, the ONÉE. That's the only way that it will be possible for low carbon, affordable, resilient, and reliable electricity to be really to become really the lifeline of the decarbonized global community that we all want to have, and become the backbone of the digital and connected cities of the future. So with that said, thank you very much for your attention, and it was a pleasure being here with you today.
Thank you very much, Adriana, for this great presentation and very interesting presentation. I think we have a time for a few questions from the audience. Once again, we invite you to type in your question in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. We've also shared the links to both reports, the Mediterranean Energy Perspectives and the Unlocking Beneficial Electrification, in the chat section, so you can find all the information in the chat section. So do we have a question? Seems that we did have one in the chat section. I think it was for Lisa. From Pedro Gonzalez, could you please explain the increase in gas in the transport sector? And I think that was referring to one slide in your presentation.
Yeah, so actually switching away from oil is going for other technologies. So we said, yeah, reducing energy, going for electricity for sure. There's also green gases, fuel cells directly or through gas, because actually in the gas there's the LNG vehicles. And so gas, especially for public transport, is going to see an increase. It's going to be a transition fuel, but also a fuel for heavier duty vehicles. So yes, the gas will increase and will be one of the solutions to step away from heavy CO2 emitter oil fuels.
Thank you, Lisa. Do we have any other questions? You can type in the chat section or in the Q&A section. Okay, we got one. How do utilities see helping with the energy transition?
So utilities, like the end users outlined in the report, are really seen as the main partners. So there are several ways that we as utilities can help the energy transition. So one is really working hand in hand with the end user on how to help them overcome some of the challenges that we can work on. So for example, I mentioned in the report, there was the peak demand charges, for example. And so we can really work with them in an innovative fashion to try to see how we can overcome those, how they can adjust their energy consumption and see how we can overcome those challenges so that they don't have to face those costs right off the bat or face them in a different way. Also, there is some innovative ways that we can work also with end users in that sense, where we are also helping them mostly efficiency on the efficiency side. So that really has a big impact on their energy consumption. We also, as utilities, work on with other stakeholders across the electricity value chain. And I also invite you to look at our last year's report on building the Electrification Alliance. There are tons of examples there on what our members' utilities are, how they're working with different stakeholders. So whether it is, like I showed in the presentation, whether it is with other, like, for example, EV manufacturers, car manufacturers, charging for to develop the charging infrastructure for the EVs that need to be in place in order to have the transport sector really see an uptake in electricity. They're also working in the R&D side, trying to develop more innovation, and really, because we have what utilities have that is very unique to us is that we also have a lot of practice on the ground. So we really know what it takes on the ground to get electricity to have a larger uptake. And we have to obviously work with end users again to make sure that their concerns and requirements are actually met. And all that to say, yes, we utilities can play a big role. I really invite you to check out that report that has a lot of more examples. But also on the other side, I want to say that we cannot do it alone. So again, it's really important to understand that we also need help from the policy side, with well-targeted policy and regulations that really help us level the playing fields with other energies to ensure that we can also send the right incentives to end users and really at the end help them build the economic case to actually switch to electricity and then help advance all the decarbonization goals.
Thank you, Adriana. We have a question here in the chat. Have you taken into consideration hydrogen as a part of the solution in the Mediterranean region?
Yes, actually we have. I didn't mention it much in the presentation as we were focusing on electrification, but hydrogen will actually account for 5 to 6% of the energy mix by 2050 in a decarbonized future. A lot of it, I mean, there will be some fuel cells directly in the transport sector, but a lot of it will be as under the shape of green gas in the gas system. So we'll green the gas down, and that's why also ties back to the previous question. Gas will be much greener because it will incorporate up to 20% hydrogen in its mix and biomethane.
Thank you, Lisa. We have another question. In terms of energy efficiency, what do we need? Do we need more government implication, or can the market regulate itself?
I think in terms of energy efficiency, we need to have, and I think that's true for probably everything, a little bit of both. So obviously, energy efficiency in and of itself is a driver in the sense that it leads to lower energy consumption and hence lower energy costs. So in terms of economics, it could in and of itself really be on its own an incentive to do so. But I think it also, we forget that that is really one of the key qualities of electricity. So governments can promote this fuel switch to electricity by highlighting this intrinsic quality that we have, that being an efficient, that it will lead to more efficient energy output and hence, like I said, lower use cost. And then also another part of the equation that is often overlooked is the fact that as electricity helps, because electricity is more efficient, it is also helping when new technologies come in, that the impact on the existing infrastructure is lower. So I think it's on the two sides. So yes, on itself, the companies themselves, when they understand really the value of energy efficiency, they can actually implement it themselves because it comes on its own, but also we need the help from governments to help raise awareness of the value. So that's why you see in the building sector, you have a lot of the codes that are coming in that are actually forcing the developers in producing, like in the case in California, and that they're producing the net zero buildings. They really have to, you have all those efficiency codes in place because of that. Like we do need some type of government input. So I think it's really a play between both.
Thank you, Adriana, and thank you, Lisa. I think that's all the time we had today. Thank you to our wonderful panelists, and thank you for all the participants to take part in today's webinar. We have, as I mentioned, we have shared the links to the reports in the chat section, so you can visit the ONÉE's website, ONÉE.org, and GSEP's website, globalelectricity.org. Thank you very much to everybody, and have a very nice day.